Welcome back to the deep dive. We are jumping straight into a topic today that is, well, it's inherently difficult.
It's polarizing.
Definitely. We're looking at migration, borders, and human trafficking.
hmm
And the moment you bring these up, the conversation just tends to lock down.
Yeah, everyone picks a side, right or wrong, and that's exactly what stops any real analysis.
So our mission today,
Uh-huh.
based on the material you shared with us, is to try and step back from that.
Right. No moralizing, no debating motives. We're here to look at systems, incentives, and outcomes.
So what a policy is supposed to do versus what it actually does on the ground.
Exactly. And the guiding question from the sources is, what problem are we actually trying to solve?
Because that's the first trap, isn't it? The sources say we almost guarantee failure when we treat 5 totally separate issues as if they were one big thing.
Yeah, all bundled under unauthorized migration. You've got 1, just people moving without permission.
Then 2, the pressure on public services.
3, worries about unfair labor competition.
4, the state's, loss of control over its own borders.
And then 5, which is completely different, is exploitation and human trafficking.
And trying to design one policy to fix all 5.
It's policy suicide. I mean, think about it. To solve for loss of control, you need total surveillance, absolute documentation.
Right. You want to know who everyone is, where they are.
But to solve for exploitation, you need the exact opposite. You need trust. You need vulnerable people to feel safe enough to come forward and report abuse.
And you can't have absolute surveillance and trust at the same time. The 2 goals are fundamentally opposed.
And that conflict is where the whole system starts to break down.
So let's start with that first systemic observation. When cross-border movement feels uncontrolled, the instinctive response is, it's always the same.
Yep. Tighten the rules. Increase the enforcement budget.
Make it physically harder to move. And that logic feels, reassuring. It feels decisive.
It feels like you're taking back control. The idea is simple. If people are still coming, the wall just isn't high enough yet.
But this completely ignores the reality that the demand for movement, whether it's for work or safety, it's what economists would call inelastic.
It doesn't just disappear when you make it harder.
It adapts. And this brings us to a really counterintuitive idea from your sources. We almost always talk about people trafficking as a cause of the problem.
Right, that traffickers are the root cause. But what the sources argue is that it's a misdiagnosis.
They argue it's more often a response.
Exactly. Smugglers and traffickers are intermediaries. They show up when the legal safe routes are restricted or capped or just painfully slow and expensive.
They're filling a market vacuum that the policy itself created.
The sources draw some really powerful analogies here to things like prohibition.
Or other policies driven by, let's say, moral discomfort.
Yeah, like with drugs or sex work. The history is clear. Trying to suppress something that's in high demand doesn't make it go away.
It just pushes it underground.
You eliminate transparency, you eliminate regulation, and you hand over a massive, profitable industry to criminal networks.
We saw it with alcohol, we see it with drugs. And the sources say human movement follows that exact same logic.
It doesn't stop. It just adapts to the most lucrative and high-risk route available. And the scarcity of legal routes is what creates the black market price.
And that's the uncomfortable reality here. When safe, legal routes shrink, the value of the illegal routes just skyrockets.
It's a market. Scarcity creates prices, it creates incentives, and it creates a huge power imbalance.
So traffickers exist not because people are just immoral, but because access is scarce and demand is high.
And here's the critical insight. The harsher the enforcement environment gets,
The more money we spend on making it risky.
the more leverage those intermediaries gain over the very people who have no choice but to rely on them.
It's a system of uneven risk, isn't it? The policy design basically decides who gets to be vulnerable.
Absolutely. If you have money, if you have social capital, you can navigate the system. You hire lawyers, you qualify for visas, you move safely.
You're insulated from that shadow system.
But hold on, the big public concern is always that if you relax enforcement, it'll just look like an open invitation, right?
Yeah, that less toughness means a flood of unmanageable numbers.
And the sources don't argue for, no rules. They argue for different rules. The point is that punitive enforcement doesn't stop migration, it just changes who profits from it.
So it's not about open borders. It's about a process that's regulated and visible instead of one that's hidden and dangerous.
Exactly. Because the data suggests that harsh enforcement just hands all the leverage, all the profit to organized crime.
So for the people without money or connections, they get forced onto those high-risk paths.
They do. They take dangerous routes, rely on smugglers, rack up huge debts.
And that debt means they have to accept exploitative work when they arrive. And they have to avoid the authorities at all costs.
Which creates this perverse feedback loop. Policies that are designed to be tough
End up doing the complete opposite of what they claim.
Right. They actually increase exploitation because a victim can't report a crime without risking their own deportation.
So crimes like assault or extortion just go unreported.
And fear just becomes a permanent part of life for an entire community. It's the inevitable outcome because the system rewards hiding. It rewards dependence on criminal networks.
And that dependence spills over into the labor market. That's where these shadow systems really get locked into the economy.
The sources call it a shadow workforce.
Which, for an unscrupulous employer, is actually an asset.
A huge asset. A workforce that lives under the constant threat of deportation is. It's the perfect control mechanism.
Because their fear of being reported acts like an invisible contract.
Of course, it makes them easier to underpay, harder to protect, and almost impossible for them to complain about abuse or unsafe conditions.
It's a choice between exploitation or deportation.
Which maximizes the employer's leverage.
And that shadow labor market ends up depressing wages and undermining standards for all low-wage workers, citizen or not.
Yes, because there's always a group of people forced to accept less.
And then, and this is the real systemic irony, the public conversation ends up blaming the migrants for the low wages that the enforcement system itself helped create.
It's a classic case of displacement. The policy didn't stop the movement, it just transferred all the risk onto the most vulnerable people.
So that brings us to the big counter-argument you always hear. But surely tougher enforcement stops trafficking, right? It makes it harder for them to operate.
And we have to ask, what does the evidence actually say?
What do the sources show?
Well, they cite a lot of data from international bodies, places like the IOM or the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, and the findings are consistent.
What do they find?
That a heavy enforcement approach consistently produces negative results. For instance, data from highly enforced border regions shows a direct correlation between increased enforcement funding and a huge spike in smuggler fees.
So it just makes it more expensive, which means more debt.
Exactly. More debt bondage. Routes become more dangerous. People are forced into deserts, onto unsafe boats. Violence goes up. And people become more dependent on those criminal networks, not less.
So the policies meant to fight exploitation are actually helping to entrench it.
Precisely. Trafficking thrives where legal options are scarce, enforcement is blunt, and desperation is high. It creates a structural barrier to rescue.
If the only person who can help you cross is a trafficker,
You're trapped. If the only person you can work for is someone who threatens to call immigration.
you're trapped. And the state built the system that makes the trap work.
So if these policies aren't working and they're just displacing the costs, where do those costs actually go?
They don't just vanish, they pop up somewhere else in the system.
They do. They move into domestic crises. You see it in ballooning budgets for enforcement and detention.
The huge costs of legal appeals.
The strain on emergency rooms dealing with people who arrive injured from these dangerous journeys. The pressure on local social services.
And when those costs create all this strain, we call it a crisis.
But we rarely trace it back to the incentives we built into the system in the first place. The incentive to hide. The incentive for exploitation.
The incentive for criminal enterprise.
Which is why the sources propose this profound reframing. If we accept that human movement isn't something you can just switch off,
Then the central policy question has to change.
it can't be how do we stop people moving? It has to be what policy design reduces exploitation, harm, and long-term cost.
And when you ask that question, you start to get completely different answers.
You move away from punishment as your main tool and toward management.
Things like safer, legal routes to undercut the smugglers.
Universally enforceable labor protections so that all workers are protected, regardless of status.
Faster processing, because long waits just fuel desperation.
Basically, creating incentives that favor visibility over fear.
And these aren't necessarily soft options, they're just systemically different. They treat movement as a factor to be managed for safety, not a crime to be eradicated with force.
And that's really the final point. Borders and rules matter. Nobody disputes that. But the systemic failure happens when we pretend that human movement can be stopped by punishment alone.
When we try to enforce that impossible standard, we don't get order.
We get displacement, we get disorder, and we get the creation of these incredibly profitable shadow systems.
It's such a compelling pattern because you see it in so many other policy areas. The policy leans too hard on punishment, moral panic shapes a law, and all the harm gets focused on the most vulnerable.
While the real costs just pop up somewhere else as a different kind of crisis.
So, to leave our listener with a final thought, based on the sources.
Here's the question to chew on. If these punitive approaches break down in the same way across totally different areas, drug policy, sex work, migration, what does that repeating pattern tell you about the fundamental flaws in how we design laws and systems in general?
Are we just leaning on punishment to solve problems that actually demand structural management?
A lot to think about there.
A profound lesson from these sources. Thank you for walking us through them.
Thank you.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.